To a lot of German soldiers on the Eastern Front, the most terrifying sound wasn't a tank or artillery barrage. It was the harsh, buzzing roar of a cheap Soviet burp gun somewhere in the snow. The PPSH-41 looked crude, stamped steel, rough wood, a fat drum magazine. But this throwaway gun burned itself into the memory of the entire Wehrmacht. Over 5 million were built in World War II, 5 times more than the already famous German MP-40. What made it truly special wasn't just the numbers. Mala kech no giet ngoi hiu kwajen mak joi puong pai kong han gia tri kwa no. German troops didn't just fear the PPSH-41. They trusted it enough to pick it up from prisoners and dead Soviet soldiers, even converting it to fired German ammo. Behind that screech is a story of total war industry and how the people's submachine gun became a symbol. In the 1930s, in the eyes of Soviet commanders, submachine guns were just supporting actors on the battlefield. The real star was still the bolt-action Mosin Nagant, long-ranged, hard-hitting, and well-proven in many earlier campaigns. Then came the Winter War with Finland 1939-1940, which hit them like a cold slap in the face. On the white snow, they watched Finnish squads armed with Suomi KP-31 na submachine submachine guns and large drum magazines suddenly crash into Soviet ranks, still clutching single-loading bolt-action rifles. And in just a few short moments, the balance of the fight flipped. The Mosin Nagant was still powerful, still accurate at long range, but its slow rate of fire became a fatal weakness at close quarters in thick forests or narrow streets. That was when a simple truth became impossible to ignore. At a distance of a few dozen meters, rate of fire decides who walks away and who gets left behind. Stalingrad. The Suomi submachine gun with its 71-round drum left a deep scar in the minds of Soviet military planners, deep enough that they understood they had no choice but to create something similar. It didn't take them long to start working on their own version. At first came the PPD-40, a gun that was indeed good-looking, but far too expensive and difficult to mass-produce on the massive scale wartime demanded. So it quickly gave way to a name that would enter the history books, the PPSH-41, a stripped-down, practical, and far more efficient version. This time they struck gold. It was cheap, rugged, easy to manufacture in huge numbers, and brutally effective in combat. Full name sounded quite long. Pistole Pulemiot Shpagina. But in soldiers' mouths, it was simply Papasha, the old man, the father, who never left their side in the fiercest fighting. What's both strange and brilliant about this weapon is that its intelligence lies precisely in its simplicity, in how it worked, and in how it was built. Instead of complex machined parts, they used stamped steel. Fast, straightforward, and cheap. The barrel was literally cut from old Mosin Nagant barrels, since they shared the same 7.62mm caliber, squeezing every last bit of use out of existing stock. The result was a weapon that could be produced at very low cost by relatively unskilled workers in makeshift wartime factories, requiring only about 5-6 man-hours per gun. Few would have guessed that this calculated roughness would help Papasha become one of the defining weapons of the Red Army in World War II. When Nazi Germany launched Operation Barbarossa and drove the Soviet Union to the brink of survival, the Red Army was short of almost everything: vehicles, artillery, even basic infantry weapons. It was in that desperate situation that this weapon appeared, at the right time in the right place, as if it had been made for this exact war. At first, it was only conceived as a stopgap solution, an emergency project to plug dangerous gaps. But very quickly, it became something much larger, almost synonymous with the Red Army itself. Wherever you looked on the Eastern Front, you could see it in Soviet hands. You could tell who was advancing just by looking at the gun they carried. That was the impression it left. While most other armies issued submachine guns only to elite units, officers, or tank crews, the Soviets took a completely different path. They organized entire companies, even larger units armed exclusively with submachine guns. And it was the Germans who first had to experience just how unpleasantly effective that choice would be. In terms of ammunition, it used a particularly interesting pistol cartridge, the 7.62-25 Tokarev, something we'll look at in more detail when we compare it to the German MP40's 9mm Luger. Mechanically, the gun operated from an open bolt using a simple blowback system that was almost so basic there was nothing left to break. The earliest versions even had a selector that allowed semi-auto or full auto fire, but over time even that was removed, leaving a pure automatic fire machine. Exactly in line with the philosophy, the simpler it is, the easier it is to produce, and the better it fits a total war. The first production batches of the PPSH used 71-round drum magazines, which on paper gave the soldier a mini ammo depot before having to reload, especially since the gun spat out around 20 rounds per second. In other words, in less than 4 seconds, all 70 rounds were gone. The problem was that the drum magazine was temperamental, prone to malfunctions, heavy, slow to reload, and requiring careful handling. So as the war went on, the Red Army gradually shifted to curved 35-round box magazines. But don't underestimate that 35-round number. At the PPSH's rate of fire, that magazine could be emptied in under 2 seconds. Picture yourself holding a bolt-action Kar 98 with just 5 rounds facing a Soviet squad, all pulling the trigger at once. The psychological balance shifts from the first burst alone. The Soviets didn't take long to realize what they had in their hands. The PPSH was rapidly issued from platoon level up to entire companies, especially to units specializing in close quarters fighting in cities. And almost immediately, it proved its real value on the battlefield. In a short time, the sight of Red Army squads armed only with submachine guns and grenades suddenly appearing right inside German positions became familiar. And for the Germans, it was a familiarity laced with anxiety. Sudden assaults, the hammering trigger pulls at point-blank range. That's what many veterans never forgot. Later, the PPSH became tightly associated with the T-34. Soviet soldiers rode on top of the tanks, charging straight into the defensive lines, then fanning out at close range, driving off German infantry while shielding the very vehicle pushing forward. Submachine gun companies could slip deep behind the lines, strike directly at machine gun nests or artillery positions, unleashing short, sharp attacks that threw German defensive formations into confusion again and again. But the PPSH's most infamous reputation was carved into history at Stalingrad through General Vasily Chuikov's hugging the enemy tactic. Amid the ruins of the city, this was almost a battlefield tailor-made for the PPSH. Once the distance between the two sides was reduced to a few meters, German artillery and supporting fire were effectively handcuffed because any error in targeting could just as easily hit their own units, locked in hand-to-hand struggle with PPSH-armed Soviet troops right in front of them. This was not just about firepower. It was about how firepower was used to twist the entire course of a battle. Fighting for each room, each floor reached an intensity that is hard to put into words. And in the memories of many German veterans, one thing stands out: those special Soviet assault groups. These were small teams of just 4 to 8 men carrying submachine guns, grenades, knives, and sometimes even flamethrowers, silently threading their way through the rubble, slipping into the German line, often at night. They would suddenly burst into places where German soldiers were sheltering, sweeping entire rooms with automatic fire and grenades in quick succession. In this kind of point-blank fighting, the PPSH's rate of over 1,200 rounds per minute turned into truly terrifying firepower. A single soldier could rush into a room and empty a full drum in about 4 seconds, sending roughly 70 bullets across a space only a few meters wide. Imagine that volume of fire in a confined room, rounds flying ricocheting off walls, ceiling, and floor, while dozens of men are crammed inside. It feels less like being shot at and more like being drowned in fire. And then, in one of those twists of wartime logic, the Germans at Stalingrad themselves began issuing PPSHs to their own assault engineers and elite infantry, using them in exactly the same kind of close-quarters combat they had once suffered from. The Germans were forced to learn a lesson in the hardest way possible under those conditions. Light automatic weapons like these were the true masters of the battlefield, and they repeatedly begged the High Command to send more MP-40s. One crucial factor was how unexpectedly reliable the PPSH proved to be in the brutal environment that defined the Eastern Front. That was also why German soldiers never hesitated to use captured ones. In contrast to the finely machined, nicely finished submachine guns they themselves produced, the PPSH was crude, plain, even ugly. But that simplicity was exactly its strength: fewer complicated parts, fewer things that could break. It endured the cold mud and filthy snow with stubborn resilience. Most of its barrels were chrome-lined, so even when knocked around, dropped, or treated roughly, the gun still did the one thing that mattered. It fired when the soldier needed it to. There was also a particular sound German soldiers dreaded: the dry, relentless bark of the PPSH, almost like an audible warning. Much like the MG-42's signature roar, it told them something was very wrong. It meant Soviet infantry were close, and where there was one man there was usually a whole group right behind him. A charge delivered by numerous soldiers, all holding weapons that poured out rounds at that kind of rate. That's not something anyone could meet with a calm mind. And to fully understand that anxiety, we have to place the PPSH side by side with its colleague on the other side of the line, the German MP-40. The MP-40 fired 9mm Luger with a notably lower muzzle velocity than the 7.62 Tokarev. In theory, the MP-40 had the advantage of a rate of fire only about half that of the PPSH, making it smoother, easier to control, and better for controlled bursts. But in return, its effective range and penetration through cover were weaker. The 7.62-25 Tokarev could punch through concrete blocks and still have effect out to around 200 yards, even though it was never designed as a long-range cartridge. The 9mm had the upper hand in pure stopping power at very short range, while Tokarev compensated not by hitting harder with each bullet, but simply by delivering more bullets. The MP-40 was certainly refined and neat, very much in the German quality tradition. But on the battlefield, the PPSH dominated thanks to three things: a very high rate of fire shear production numbers and the ability to function in almost any condition. In 1 second, the MP-40 fired about 10 rounds. The PPSH could push out about 20. On the Eastern Front, where urban combat became more and more common, those numbers were not just technical details. They were questions of life and death. When dozens of Soviet soldiers pulled the trigger at the same time, they created a dense wall of fire, even though on paper, it was still just pistol-caliber ammunition. And by the way, there was once a particularly odd idea. Someone mounted 88 PPSHs inside the bomb bay of a bomber, creating a system known as the Fire Hedgehog. The fact that this concept was ever seriously proposed says a lot about how highly people rated the PPSH's firepower. There was indeed a time when people came up with that strange plan, packing up to 88 PPSHs into a bomber's bomb bay and having them fire down on infantry below. The project was quickly shelved, but the idea alone shows just how much they believed in the PPSH's volume of fire. Of course, Papasha was far from perfect. Because it was rushed into mass production during wartime, many parts didn't fit together perfectly. Just picking it up and giving it a slight shake could make it rattle, a sound that could easily betray a soldier's position as he tried to creep up on enemy lines in the dark. A more serious concern lay in safety. The bolt mechanism was very simple and mainly intended for automatic fire. If the gun was dropped or hit hard, an entire magazine could discharge unintentionally. A PPSH suddenly going off in the middle of a friendly group is something everyone dreaded, and there are quite a few stories among partisan units about accidents exactly like that. Another very recognizable trait was the bright three-pronged muzzle flash when it fired at night, visually striking but also a beacon for the enemy. Even so, compared to its firepower, durability, and ease of use, those drawbacks were not nearly enough to overshadow the PPSH's importance on the battlefield. Out there in combat, the PPSH didn't win by looking good. It won with the things that decide life and death: overwhelming fire, tough reliability, and a level of simplicity in use and production that almost anyone could master. So it's no surprise that after a short time, even the Germans were forced to see it differently. What began as wariness turned into respect. And finally, they took one more step. They built their own for German use version of it. Remember that in the standard German squad organization, everything revolved around the Kar-98 rifle. Submachine guns were effectively a privilege for officers, or a handful of men in each unit. In reality, only about 1 in 10 soldiers carried an MP40, and the later STG-44 was even rarer. Watching Red Army squads with PPSHs close in and dominate at short range, German soldiers first picked up captured weapons simply because they needed firepower. But the High Command quickly made this official, adding the PPSH to their list of weapons in regular service. Over 10,000 were rebarreled to fire 9mm ammunition and fitted with adapters to use MP40 magazines. Interestingly, though, many soldiers actually preferred the original Soviet configuration with 7.62-25. They could feel the advantage in range and penetration whenever they pulled the trigger out on the front lines. By 1943-1944, as the war entered its most brutal phase, the Soviets didn't stop at the PPSH-41. They pushed the idea of the submachine gun even further with the PPS-43. It still used the 7.62-25 Tokarev cartridge, but the weapon itself was smaller, lighter, with an even simpler stamped steel construction, a 35-round magazine, and a folding stock. In other words, it was a compact version tailor-made for tank crews and close combat in tight spaces. Yet the old man PPSH-41 was never truly replaced. It continued to be produced in large numbers and remained present across Soviet units. Some estimates say that more than half of Soviet infantrymen carried some variant of the PPSH. From this point on, tactics shifted fully toward tank infantry assaults, closing in aggressively at short range. For German soldiers, Trying to hold the line at a time when the tide of war was turning, this was a deeply worrying prospect. The PPSH's effectiveness did not end in 1945. It went on to see action in the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and many other conflicts afterward. By the 1950s, with the rise of the assault rifle, combining the characteristics of the bolt-action rifle and the submachine gun using intermediate cartridges, the PPSH's role gradually shrank. Yet submachine guns never disappeared. They continued to serve in the hands of special forces and law enforcement units, a living relic of an entire era.